So, how does walking the tightrope, the narrow bridge, help us navigate the turbulent waters of forgiveness? So, on the general level, the capacity to live in the both and, to be a bridge person, right? Everything I talked about on Rosh Hashanah helps create the space to live with dilemmas in general, and specifically to soften the edges of what seems like a clear-cut divide between love and law and justice, what's true. On Rosh Hashanah, I said that when we look in the mirror, it's only possible to see the truth of ourselves through both and thinking, right? I am the basically good person I like to think I am, and also I'm capable of wrongdoing and have what to repent for. Now, obviously, that applies also to how we see each other, especially someone who's hurt or disappointed us. Granting forgiveness isn't about ignoring bad behavior or problematic qualities or their impact on us. It's about holding simultaneously also the other person's strengths, all the good that they bring into our lives and into the world, perhaps also the compassion for the way they themselves have been hurt, right? Or are struggling or are suffering, and of course, how much we love them. It's another's wrongdoing plus their humanity and our relationship. In Jewish mystical thought, emet, truth, and rachamim, compassion, are always pictured at the center of the diagram, holding and balancing love and justice and heaven and earth, the ideal and the reality. And that's because, like truth, compassion and the possibility of forgiveness necessarily emerges from the both and stance, right? From the ability to bridge. But there's also a very specific both and tension that helps a lot here. Joy, actually, you raised it Shabbat morning in our discussion, right? And that's the question of the tension of connection and distance. In Jewish thought, that's actually sort of a reframe of the love-law dilemma. Chesed, love, includes this notion of sort of undifferentiated, unbounded oneness, the connection of everything. And Deen, which is law, includes also the notion of boundaries and distinctions and separation and distance. So one aspect of being a bridge person is internalizing that, like every other virtue, even bridge building itself is not an absolute. As we'll see tomorrow, it has to be done with sensitivity to the right time, the right measure, the right materials. Because here's the thing about bridges. They connect across distance and difference. They don't eliminate distance or difference. You can take the GW Bridge from New York to New Jersey and back again, right? Actually, good luck with that. Right? Maybe you can take it from there and back again. But there's still two very different states. There's still a river in between. And there are gaps that can't and shouldn't be bridged. There is the possibility of a bridge too far. The most central one being the reality of human difference, and more pointedly, the unbridgeable gap in our knowledge of another person. Without even being aware that we are doing it, we are constantly filling in the lacunae in our perceptions and understandings of everything. And we fill it in with stuff that we just make up, right? It's how movies work. Our brain bridges the gaps between one image and the next. It's actually, in my limited understanding, how vision works, right? We're sort of hardwired to do that. And certainly it's the same in how we see other people. We've made a connection with someone else, Baruch Hashem, wonderful. That doesn't mean that we ever know the totality of that person. We're filling in an awful lot, building bridges between our experience of that person and who that person actually is, what they think, intend, feel. We may be right, we may be wrong. I recently learned about a thing called correspondence bias. Have you heard of this? It refers to the human tendency to assume that another person's actions correspond to their overall personhood or personality, right? Particular behavior or words are reflective of essence, who they really are. And it turns out, research shows, we have a proven tendency to discount or fail to consider external factors and circumstances which may have contributed to that person's particular behavior. We jump to the conclusion that that's who they are. At least the evidence says with other people, right? Research shows that mostly with ourselves, we tend to do the opposite. We attribute all our bad behavior to extrinsic circumstances and factors. I didn't get enough sleep last night, I wasn't paying attention. Obviously, this is not true of everyone. Some of us cut everyone else slack and internalize every error of our own as evidence that we're terrible people. But statistically, with most people, my bad behavior, intemperate, foolish speech, was an error, an accident, an aberration caused by something out there, out of my control. But your bad behavior, intemperate, foolish speech, is a revelation of who you really are, and how can I ever trust you again? Right? Maybe yes, maybe no. Mostly we're making these judgments on slim evidence indeed. I think the cancel culture is a perfect example of this. The reality is that we know far less about other people than we think we do. And even if it turns out that we're right, that this thing that someone did or said actually is indicative of some part of who they are, it doesn't mean it's all of who they are. Forgiveness becomes possible when we realize there's more to the story, more to the person than this thing. As Brian Stevenson famously and beautifully said, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. This is one reason why the two people had to walk the tightrope for forgiveness and pardon to be possible. As much as reconciliation and forgiveness depend upon bridging and connection, they depend also on our acknowledging the limits of connection, the gaps and boundaries that remain unbridged, perhaps unbridgeable. Walking across that narrow bridge is about holding both. And boy, you walk across a narrow bridge, a tightrope over a chasm, you know it's there. And in that chasm of not knowing is the space for even strict justice than I think it is. For the truth to be a little more complex than I know. Did you ever watch that show, The Good Place? It's really a great show, very profound show about like ethics and what we owe each other. It's really interesting. And one of the theses in The Good Place was for a while, and the whole point of it is like, figuring out who's going to the good place and the bad place after death, right? So one thing they tried, heaven tried this, right? The powers that be tried this. They tried a point system. So you get points for all the good things you do, and you lose points for all the bad things you do, and there's this like great book in the sky, right? It's how some of us think of the imagery of the book on Yom Kippur. And in the show, and I think rightly, it turned out it was completely, totally unworkable. And they had to chuck the system. Because it was so complex. Like the figuring out of the point system of what's good and what's not good and what's a plus and what's a minus, well, it depends on how far how far reaching you consider the consequences, right? You think about like how many of us think that, it's so terrific we have electric cars, and then we find out like, oh, it turns out that, the material that we need to make the electric car, we're doing all kinds of terrible damage somewhere else. It's real, life is complex. So I have a little more to say about this later. For now, I just want to remind us that last week on Rosh Hashanah, I ended my teaching by saying, quoting E.M. Forster, only connect That was the whole of her sermon. Now, on Yom Kippur, we need to add, mind the gap.